Hello everyone, I hope you're all having a wonderful day. Today, we're diving into a story that begins with a shocking question that could destroy everything. What if the woman you love might actually be your biological sister? In this episode, we'll uncover the tense confrontation between James and his father, the devastating suspicion about Diep's identity, and the emotional battle between blood ties and true love. If you find this story powerful and gripping, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming videos. The house was unusually quiet that night. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind that presses against your ears and makes every breath feel louder than it should. A single desk lamp glowed in the corner, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. James sat across from his father, a glass of water in his hand. The water wasn't shaking because of the room. It was shaking because of him. He didn't want half-truths anymore. No more vague warnings. No more, "You'll understand later." He leaned forward and asked the question directly, the one that had been suffocating him ever since his father hinted at it. "Is Diep your biological daughter?" The words hung in the air like something fragile and dangerous. His father didn't answer right away. He sighed, the kind of sigh that carries years of buried memories. Then, in a low and steady voice, he began to speak about the past. He talked about his youth, about Diep's mother, about a love that had once burned fiercely but had been crushed by reality. His family had been poor. Diep's family had been wealthy and powerful. The gap between them wasn't just financial, it was social, cultural, impossible to bridge. He said they were forced apart. He said he never truly stopped loving her. James felt his chest tighten. He pressed further. Was she pregnant before marriage? The question felt almost cruel, but he needed to know. His father admitted that years later, when timelines began to disturb him, he had quietly investigated. The more he looked, the more the suspicion grew. Dates, encounters, overlaps, small details that didn't sit right. Then came the moment that split the room in half. "I'm certain," his father said, "Diep is my biological daughter." There was regret in his eyes, but also conviction. A terrible kind of certainty. James felt something tear inside him. The room suddenly felt smaller, as if the walls were inching closer. The lamp flickered slightly, and in that dim light, his father's wrinkled hands looked older than ever, like hands that had been carrying a secret far too long. James, sitting there with his youth and stubborn hope, felt like innocence was being ripped from him in real time. He imagined the worst. If this were true, then everything, every laugh with Diep, every quiet promise, every future they had whispered about, would collapse instantly. But he couldn't accept it. He shook his head sharply, his voice cracked as he argued back. Diep didn't resemble his father. The ages didn't align. Diep was younger than him, and the timing didn't make sense. After his mother passed away, his father met Ms. Dieu. How could that have resulted in Diep? It didn't add up. To James, this felt like manipulation, like fear, disguised as concern. "You're just trying to separate us," he accused, anger flashing in his eyes. But beneath that anger was pain. His father remained calm, almost too calm. He suggested a DNA test. A simple solution, he said. Science doesn't lie. But to James, that suggestion felt like a knife twisting deeper. A test meant doubt. A test meant acknowledging that maybe this nightmare could be real. Inside, his world spiraled. He couldn't imagine siblings falling in love. He replayed the day he met Diep. How natural it felt, how unexpected and beautiful it had been. It felt like fate. Now that same fate threatened to become something monstrous. His father repeated his certainty. Each repetition pushed James further into emotional freefall. Finally, James snapped. He declared he didn't believe it. Not a single word. The silence that followed was deafening. The narrow room seemed darker now, the air heavier. The contrast between blood ties and burning love sharpened like a blade between them. On one side stood family, obligation, history, loyalty. On the other side stood love, fragile but fiercely alive. James clenched his fists, his nails pressing into his palms as if physical pain could anchor him. His father's steady gaze didn't waver. Conviction met rebellion. The flickering light above them felt symbolic. Like certainty itself was unstable. James felt himself shifting internally. The obedient son who trusted his father was dissolving. In his place stood someone defiant, someone who would fight for what he believed in. But beneath that defiance, a seed of doubt had already been planted. And doubt, once planted, grows in silence. The room held the weight of unspoken regret. Regret for a past love that never found closure. Regret for a present love now under siege. Regret for truths that might destroy more than they protect. Hope still flickered in James, but it was fragile, like a candle trembling in wind. He walked out of that room not with clarity, but with conflict burning in his chest. He didn't know whether he was running from the truth or running toward the only thing he couldn't afford to lose. And somewhere behind him, in that dimly lit space, filled with ghosts of old memories, his father remained seated, carrying both certainty and sorrow like twin burdens that could no longer be hidden. The tension in the house hadn't faded when Diep stepped inside. She didn't hear the conversation, but she felt it. The air still carried that heavy silence, the kind that lingers after something explosive has happened. James wasn't crying. He wasn't angry. He was just serious. Too serious. And that scared her more than anything. "What happened?" she asked gently, studying his face. James avoided her eyes for a second too long. Diep's chest tightened. Her mind began racing. She remembered the time James had suddenly sent her away without explanation. The distance in his voice back then. That same distance was flickering now, faint but noticeable. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure if the ground beneath her was stable. She scanned the room instinctively, as if clues might be written into the walls. But all she found was silence. Thick, suffocating silence. Inside her, anxiety rose like a storm tide. Their relationship had been her safe place, her certainty. Now something invisible was pressing against it. Something she couldn't see, but could definitely feel. Had she done something wrong? Was this about her? The more she thought about it, the darker her thoughts became. The peaceful days they'd shared suddenly felt fragile, like glass memories that could shatter with one sentence. Before she could press James further, his father approached. He moved slowly, holding out a glass of water to her. The gesture looked caring on the surface, but his expression was too solemn, too deliberate. "This is a family matter," he said quietly. The words hit her harder than expected. Family matter. And she was somehow in the middle of it. He didn't dance around it. He told her directly she should leave James, not once, not casually, but repeatedly, calmly, firmly. Each repetition carried pressure. Diep felt something twist inside her. Gratitude and anger collided in her chest. This was the same man who had once helped her during a difficult time, who had shown kindness. And now, he was asking her to walk away from the person she loved. "Why?" she asked, her voice steady but strained. "You'll understand someday," he replied. That answer created a void instead of clarity. Understand what? The room seemed to narrow around her. Her pulse quickened. She felt isolated, even though she wasn't physically alone. His words were measured, but they carried weight, like echoes from a past she wasn't allowed to see. "I won't leave him," she said finally. "Please don't try to stop us anymore." Her voice didn't tremble, but inside, everything was shaking. When he walked away, he left behind more questions than answers. Later, sitting alone in a quiet corner, Diep's thoughts spiraled. She remembered Hung, the friend who had always comforted her when she felt overwhelmed. Even now, thinking of him brought a flicker of steadiness. But this was different. This wasn't just sadness. This was uncertainty attacking the foundation of her life. The idea of a DNA test crossed her mind. What if it proved something terrible? The thought alone made her stomach drop. If the results confirmed what James's father claimed, everything would collapse. Not just their relationship, but her identity. No, she rejected it. In her heart, she convinced herself that this was manipulation, a strategy to push them apart. Maybe fear disguised as concern, maybe control disguised as protection. Her inner world felt like a turbulent sea, hope and fear crashing into each other violently. She imagined losing James, the one who had stood beside her in the fields, who laughed with her over sugarcane breaks, who believed in building something simple and real. The pressure was unbearable. "I can't live like this," she whispered to herself, tears finally breaking free. The room around her felt enormous and empty at the same time. Silence echoed back at her, amplifying every doubt. Inside, something shifted. She moved from hesitation into denial, from questioning into resistance. She refused to let unseen secrets dictate her love. Meanwhile, James was alone as well, but his storm was different. He replayed every word his father had said, over and over, searching for cracks, for inconsistencies, and then something inside him solidified. Diep wasn't at fault. If there was deception, it wasn't hers. He convinced himself that his father was lying, or at least mistaken. Maybe guilt from the past had distorted his judgment. Maybe regret was rewriting history. But love felt real, immediate, alive. He decided, no more tests, no more entertaining doubt. He stood up abruptly. "I won't leave her," he said aloud, even though no one was in the room to hear it. In that moment, his internal shift was complete. Doubt burned away, replaced by fierce determination. Family pressure weighed heavily, but his emotional bond with Diep felt heavier. He chose love. When he found her, there were no dramatic speeches at first, just relief in their eyes, shared understanding, without needing full explanations. Later, they returned to the fields together. The open sky felt different from the suffocating house, wider, cleaner. They worked side by side, shaping raised beds in the sandy soil, planting potatoes, sweet potatoes, carrots, pumpkins. The labor was exhausting, but grounding. James admitted, half laughing, that sometimes he regretted leaving his old director position for this physically demanding life. But only a little, he added quickly. Diep smiled. "We'll get used to it." They took a break under the sun, chewing on purple sugarcane borrowed from neighbors. Sweet, slightly salty, refreshing. They talked about planting plans, diversifying crops, reducing risk, 2 rows of this, 2 rows of that. If one failed, another might thrive. It wasn't just about farming, it was about building something together. Their exhaustion contrasted with their joy. Their hands were dirty, their backs ached. But when they looked at each other, there was peace. As they rested briefly, James said quietly, "I won't give up, not as long as you are here." Diep met his gaze. Neither mentioned DNA tests, neither mentioned family pressure, but both understood the storm wasn't over. The rural space, the earthy smell, the rhythm of hose hitting soil, worms wriggling in fertile ground, felt symbolic. Roots digging deep despite uncertainty above. Love, like crops, required patience, faith, effort. As the sun lowered, James added softly, "Whatever it is, don't hide anything from me." She nodded. No more secrets. The past might still be lurking, heavy and unresolved. But in that moment, standing in the field, with dirt-stained hands and tired smiles, they chose connection over fear. Pressure hadn't disappeared. Doubt hadn't fully died. But hope, stubborn and resilient, still burned between them. And sometimes, that's enough to keep planting.